Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. It is so great to have you here. We are so thankful that you could join us. My name is Tahil Sharma, and I'm the Faith Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force. And we are super excited to be able to have you all be a part of this conversation today on striving for equality in the Buckeye State, a conversation on faith and LGBTQ plus advocacy. For those of you that don't know about the task force is one of the oldest advocacy organizations dedicated to LGBTQ rights in the country. We have been striving to do the work of liberation for trans and queer people for decades. And in the process of that work, one of the important elements to how we do this advocacy is through a lens of faith. While many folks may consider the challenges of LGBTQ advocacy to actually be antithetical to engagement with faith and spirituality, decades of work, decades of communities, and thousands of people can tell us a different story. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do a program like this in collaboration with the Interfaith Center at Miami University is because we wanted to be able to create a space and invite folks who can speak to some of these different elements, which is why I'm really happy to be able to share this space digitally with some really awesome folks who are representing some really amazing things that are going on the ground in the state of Ohio and who are doing that work nationally. Um, so I'm happy to be able to present some of these folks today. Alan Morris, pronouns are he and they, the Director of Policy at the National LGBTQ Task Force, aka one of my colleagues. Joseph Zay Soza from Equality Ohio, their pronouns are he, elle, and we. And Reverend Dr. Ben Huelskamp, pronouns he and they, who is the executive director at LOVEBoldly, an organization based out of Ohio. Um, and we're really excited to be able to jump in, but keeping in mind that there's so much going on, I'd actually like to engage in a bit of a grounding exercise. I think it's very important that we don't ignore that this call is not happening in a bubble. It's definitely not happening in separation to what might be going on in the world. And we want to be able to create a space where we can feel some sort of calm as we're about to engage in difficult conversation, but also try to navigate some of the ways that we find hope and inspiration from what we're going to hear from our speakers today. So, if everyone would like to close their eyes and take a couple of deep breaths, this will be a great way to be able to start our time together. Take a deep breath in and out. Take a deep breath in and out. Take a deep breath in and one more time, let it out. We know at a time of great difficulty, of great struggle for our communities, we know that it's important for us to find grounding to be able to face injustice. We know at these times it is important to lean on our colleagues and loved ones to be able to find inspiration, to find grace, and to find hope. But it is also important for us to find this time to be able to breathe as we do the work of resistance. So make sure that whenever you need to take care of yourselves during this call, that you do so, because rest is not just resistance. Rest is an opportunity to actually live into your full self authentically so that you can do the work of justice and liberation for all. So thank you for joining me in that short exercise. I want to make sure that on that tone of getting to talk about grounding, spirituality, and how faith might be showing up, I'd like to pass it on to our first speaker, Reverend Dr. Ben Huelskamp, who's going to open us up to talking about his work at Love Boldly. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here with us. Again, my name is Reverend Dr. Ben Huelskamp. I use they pronouns, and I am the executive director of a small nonprofit, faith-based nonprofit here in Ohio, called Love Boldly. Love Boldly, which is now in our 15th year, this is our celebratory year. Um, our work is situated at the intersection of faith, specifically Christianity, although we do work in an interfaith context, so we acknowledge that interfaith context just in the world we live in. But again, at the intersection of faith, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Um, our work has always been about bringing people together um, and and trying to encourage dialogue to happen um, between allies or developing allies and members of the queer community, people who have perhaps never met someone who claims both the title and identity of queer and Christian, or trans and Christian, or other identities found within the queer community. Um, our work really started working with more conservative organizations and has now developed to mostly working in a progressive advocacy and progressive faith space. Um, I would say that Love Boldly specifically tends to have our work fit into one of three kind of, I always call them buckets. One bucket is resource development. We do devotionals. We do a glossary of words that someone might encounter, that someone of a particularly a Christian faith background might encounter in the queer community and not know what it means. That resource is called Words Can Crush, and it also offers people some language or some ideas of changing their language to be more inclusive and to be more affirming of queer people. In addition to resource development, we also do a large amount of education. We engage in events like this. We engage in other panels that we hold. We're actually sponsoring one this coming Thursday in Columbus on anti-LGBTQ violence and Christian nationalism. We hold these events in hopes of educating the public, but particularly people of faith, around what it means to be and what dynamics show up in the LGBTQIA plus community. And our last bucket, or our last area of engagement, is around policy and advocacy. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We don't lobby, but we do engage in the work of advocacy, particularly at the Ohio State House. We show up to testify either for the few good bills and against the unfortunately many negative bills that come across the Ohio legislature right now. We write for different publications. We show up and we co-sponsor and collaborate with other organizations to put on demonstrations. And I think one of the biggest things we try to do, in addition to bringing a faith voice to LGBTQ advocacy, we also, because we're grounded in Christianity, do a lot to push back against what has become known as Christian nationalism, or the frankly sin of mixing a perverted, warped view of Christian faith and Christian practice, in the words of Jesus, with extreme nationalism and fascism. And unfortunately, we see this popping up too often. What at one point was a fringe theory has become the guiding orientation of too many of our political leaders and others who influence them. So Love Boldly shows up in that space to say there are other Christians out here who don't ascribe to this fascist, nationalist perversion of Christianity. There are some of us who are willing to show up, not just because we ourselves are progressive, but because we read in the words of Jesus that we need to show up on the side of the immigrant, on the side of the queer person, on the side of the trans person, on the side of someone who is poor or is facing housing insecurity or houselessness. Any of these issues, we are not to make their lives harder. We are to show up with them, hold solidarity with them, and approach our world from the margins, because that's exactly where Jesus approached things. So again, our work fits in those different broad areas. A lot of our work with Love Boldly, and I would say with faith-based organizing in general, is collaborative. It's about partnerships. It's about strengthening the work that others are doing as well. So here in Ohio with LOVEBoldly, we do a lot of work with Equality Ohio that Zay will speak to shortly. We do work with Honesty for Ohio Education, with other organizations that are organizing, that are building coalitions and building power here in Ohio, not only because it helps us, a small organization, amplify and build our own capacity, but also because we want to make sure that there are faith-based voices in those spaces and be able to show up, be able to, live out our faith in the way that we have felt called to do. So I'm not sure, Tehil, if that was 10 minutes, but um, that's kind of what I have to say. And again, I really appreciate you all being here to listen, and I appreciate the space to be able to say that.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. I really do appreciate some of the perspective that you put in front of folks that, obviously there is this really challenging place where we have to meet people where folks that may identify, deeply with their religious beliefs, may hold certain perceptions or assumptions about folks from other communities and how we navigate that conversation among queer and trans folks who have certain perceptions about religious people due to trauma they've experienced, due to narratives that they may have been exposed to, or to the stereotyping that may have occurred because of public discourse around religion. So I think it's really important that you piece that together in a way where people do understand that there are folks like yourself through running organizations like LOVEBoldly who are actively trying to represent that, especially when there are ways to be able to speak up for this dilemma that Christianity is facing in particular, which is that of a controlled socio-political theological narrative that's being presented. Um, so it's really awesome to be able to hear about some of that work initially, and we'll hopefully get to learn more. Now I'm happy to pass it over to our friend Zay, who's going to be presenting about his work at Equality Ohio. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Um, my name is Joseph and also Zay. I use either name. Lately, I've been using Zay a lot more in the various communities I'm embedded in, and it's been lovely. I'm an individual who enjoys having multiple names. Um, so, anyways, you'll hear folks refer to me either or, don't get confused. I use he, him pronouns primarily, but not exclusively. I'm based in Columbus, Ohio currently, and I engage in advocacy work with Equality Ohio, in addition to a number of other things that I do on the side. I do some advocacy work with the Young Latino Network here in Ohio. Recently, I am a yoga teacher and facilitator of meditation and breathwork practice, and am just in a stage of life where I'm enjoying continuing to grow and be a multifaceted person, which I think feeds this work that we do. Those of us who spend much of our time involved in advocacy and activism, um, it can be very heavy work, and it's um, important to live in balance. And this is why I really appreciate this particular conversation about faith and LGBTQ identity, because faith is something that touches all of us. And I guess I'll go into talking about Equality Ohio, but I want to share a little bit of my personal story of how I even arrived at Equality Ohio. I grew up in Ohio, a minister's kid, actually, in a Pentecostal Christian um, upbringing and tradition. I'm from a mixed culture household, Puerto Rican and Caucasian. Parents, and so I grew up in multicultural churches with people from a variety of different backgrounds that were people of a very expressive, Holy Spirit centered faith expression, and not very. long into my childhood, that was a weird way to say that. It didn't take very long in my childhood for me to realize that I was queer, right? And I didn't always have the language to express that, even just with myself. But I knew that the way that I related to my body, to relationships, to pleasure, to romance, to gender, all of it was different than what I saw around me, right? And what was represented around me in my church communities. Um, and I had, as many people who grow up in faith and especially ministers' kids, a lot of struggles, right? Coming into myself and claiming my own autonomy as an individual and naming my sense of identity, my relationship with identity, um, as well as my relationship with faith. That has been the both of those stories have undergone quite an evolution. Um, to this day, just for full disclosure, I do not identify with Christianity. Um, I uh, I am spiritual. I actually identify as Buddhist, not necessarily exclusively. But I have a great respect for my faith upbringing. I certainly was brought up by parents who took their faith very seriously, um, who who made it a point to study and back their faith with learning and reading. I guess if I could just put it that way. Um, and so I think I have my own sort of complex relationship um, with Christianity specifically, and especially given that we're living in an environment of Christian nationalism, as Ben pointed out, which is impacting all of us, right? So negatively. Anyways, this was some of my story. When I moved to Columbus looking for work, I wanted to be involved in advocacy, and I encountered Equality Ohio. And it was through Equality Ohio's advocacy that I actually came to learn about the gaps in civil rights that exist in Ohio for LGBTQ people. I had grown up an LGBTQ person my whole life and not actually been aware of how vulnerable legally, right, we are as queer people in this state. I think it was very eye-opening for me to find out, for example, that Ohio does not have any statewide discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. It is still legal in most of the state of Ohio for people to be fired from their jobs for being transgender, right? Or for being turned away from the restaurant or, what have you. That was stunning to me when I learned that. And it also made sense because of lived experience. I felt up to that point like my understanding of the struggle in Ohio was more that it was cultural, right? It was in community where our struggle as queer people exists. But to learn that no, there's actually also a legal disenfranchisement, a conspiracy really to disenfranchise us from social systems that works hand in hand with the cultural and community um, disenfranchisement that many of us face. And so when I learned this, I knew that I wanted to be involved in this work. And so currently the role that I have is local advocacy. I focus on working with local governments, local communities on their hyperlocal policy. Meanwhile, Equality Ohio also has a whole department focused on the state policy, similar to what Ben mentioned that some of the work LOVEBoldly is involved with. We've been in partnership with taking action on all of the legislation that is moving through the state. And in the last, I would say, half a decade, the onslaught of legislative attack against our community has heightened exponentially. We have seen across the country, not just in Ohio, an exorbitant number of very harmful legislation and policy introduced, some of which has passed. Most recently in Ohio, well, not most recently, but one of the more recent bills has been um, what we've called a ban on gender-affirming healthcare for youth, and this has had such far-reaching consequences, even for some adults that are trying to seek care, right? Um, and then at the same time, we have bills that we have tried to advocate for, such as a bill that would protect us against discrimination officially. Or, and I think this is particularly relevant for this moment, a bill that would ban the practice of conversion therapy in Ohio, which has remained stalled and just hasn't moved right in the state house. And I'm sure Alan will get into this a little bit more. Unfortunately, we had a recent Supreme Court case decision that was very unfortunate for the fight against conversion therapy, right? I won't get super into that right now. We can later. So in the meantime, while things are so difficult at the federal level of government and just impossible at the state government, right? Um, we my job allows us to um, experience some small wins, which are really big wins, in the form of working with local communities that are willing to actually um, do something beneficial and protecting LGBTQ people, at least in their city. And so we have more than, I think, 36, I hope I have that number right, 36 municipalities in the state of Ohio that have officially included gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation as protected classes against discrimination in their city. We have 16 municipalities that have officially banned the practice of conversion therapy in their city. And more, I'm getting to work with a lot of cities and small governments, municipalities, on this type of work that's creating a patchwork of civil rights in Ohio while we don't have it statewide. So that's a little bit about what I do. It's very rewarding work. This has probably been more than 10 minutes, but I want to quickly mention also one other resource that we have at Equality Ohio, just for your awareness, and that is a free legal clinic that is free for LGBTQ Ohioans who live within 300% of the poverty level. That's most of us, unfortunately. Um, and there are, I believe, like 7 different areas of law in which our attorneys will provide counsel, provide service. And in the case that a client has a case that's outside of our jurisdiction, we have a very extensive referral network of attorneys who we know to be LGBTQ safe and competent that we can refer folks off to. So please keep our legal clinic resource in mind for yourself or anyone you know who might have a legal need, even if it's seeking like a name change or a gender marker change. We will help out with those. So just wanted to mention that resource there. And with that, I think I'll stop talking.
No worries at all. This is why we're trying to, create the space for you to be able to share that information to make sure that people know that there are resources available. And Zaid, just thank you for being able to talk about the importance of that grassroots work. It's so important that people have to remember that in engaging in this work, yes, whatever hits the national discourse is essential, but so much of what gets impacted nationally starts from local conversations, starts from local collaborations. Um, and we want to be able to remind people that those communities, those organizations are out there trying to do the work. They're trying to accompany and reinforce this idea that our ability to be in alliance and community with each other can actually provide positive and effective results. And it takes work like fellow organizations like Equality Federation to be able to do that. So just want to share that gratitude for you to share. Now I'm happy to pass it on to my colleague, Alan, please.
Thank you, Tahil. Hello, everyone. Alan Morris, my pronouns are he, they. I am the Director of Policy here at the task force. I work alongside the amazing Tahil. So I want to name that when Tahil asked me to do this on a faith perspective, I laughed internally because similar to my colleague, Joseph, like I have left the church for quite some time. I still consider myself a saved, sanctified, and Holy Ghost filled Black man from the South, right? But there are elements of the way that I was raised. There are elements of the way that Christianity has caused harm in my personal life, which has impacted the way I see many different things, right? And I think to go throughout the last 10 years of my career and to see the rise in Islamophobia, the rise in xenophobia, the rise in white Christian nationalism, right? Like these things are all interconnected. And in most cases, they start at the top, y'all, and then they flow down, right? And I'm personally, I'm constantly trying to keep myself grounded on ways that we can not only push back, but we can humanize so many issues at once, right? That stated, the task force is the nation's oldest LGBTQ organization. Right now, we are working on queering democracy, queering equity, and queering faith. Please bear with me because we are in the midst of some changes of what our pillars are. I hope I got that right. Tahil Mira, if there's anything I say that needs to be corrected, feel free to add it down in the chat. I got my colleagues here to help me out. Now, that stated, we have several priority states that we're working in. Texas, Florida, North Carolina. We're also focusing on DC as a region, fighting for DC statehood. We're also going to be focusing highly on where we're going next for creating change, which is Kentucky. But there are also ballot measure states that are popping up for us, which is Ohio, Maine, Missouri, Washington, right? And so ballot measures and state-based legislative advocacy is really, really popping off for us in many different ways because we are seeing some of the attacks show up in places and spaces that we have often viewed as sanctuary, right? And so that in itself is teaching us a very large lesson that where federal policy is not just shaping programs or funding, it's actively redefining who is seen, protected, and valued in this country and how it flows down to the state level, as I stated before, right? Now, for trans folks, for immigrants, for young people, for our disabled people, we are seeing them under attack every single day, right? And the federal government is increasingly stepping back from protecting, and they're now creating new forms of harm, right? For faith leaders, I think this is not abstract, right? And these policies are showing up in real ways and in people's lives. And I think what is critical is when people have to determine on if they're safe at school, if they're able to access care, if they're going to be treated with dignity from systems that claim to serve them, we have a problem, right? And this is where the rise in fascism and authoritarianism is very, very clear. And it's flowing in many different ways, right? I'm also really proud of so many of our community members and cross movement. Folks are pushing back, right? We see what's happening with the No Kings rallies. We see what's happening in places like Minneapolis that are pushing back against ICE, right? Like this is giving me so much synergy, right? Which kind of takes me back to the era of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. We are seeing people really show up in ways where it's like, no, we're not going to sit here and allow a government to put us in a dictatorship, right? I think the question before us is whether moral leadership will meet this moment with clarity and courage, right? I'm having intentional conversations in the state of Texas with local leaders about what does it look like to not only show up in ways that serve the community, but when we bring in our faith leaders coming from the South, how are you engaging where this goes beyond the pulpit, right? This goes beyond that 10%, right? This goes beyond that special offering. And I'm speaking from a Christian lens in that sense because that's all that I know, right? And so, but the intention and the way that many people show up in their faith is very, very similar, right? And so I'm working through what would it look like for faith leaders to have intentional conversations with their delegates and their constituents and bring it back to members of Congress, bring it back to their local elected officials and say, here's what is impacting us, and here are the ways that you can fix it, right? And that's where the clarity comes in. That's where the integrity comes in. But more than anything, that's where the courage comes in. Many faith leaders are not willing to go there, specifically in the South, out of fear of retribution, right? So how can we encourage them? How can we not only be in solidarity with them, but let them know that they have resources and folks that are coming behind them in many different ways, right? I want to name a few of the, critical issues that we're seeing at the, federal level. One of them being where there are the attacks on Title IX and transgender students, right? Where the, federal government is, basically saying that they're not going to protect gender identity, right? We're also seeing where the president thinks that he can executive order himself into anything. Right? It's like, oh, I want today to be, a Wednesday all over again. I'm going to sign a executive order and today is going to be Wednesday twice, right? But what we're seeing is that is changing the trajectory of how the federal government is showing up and how they're following the Constitution. And that's the problem. When you have someone at the top that is not following the Constitution and the rule of law, then we're starting to see that there is a constant a delay in what it means to have liberation, right? One of the executive orders that have really, stuck out to me is the attacks on what it means to identify as trans, right? And so that executive order, I think it's 14168, one of them. Sorry, y'all. I can get real nerdy with all the policy stuff. But he signed a executive order establishing a narrow definition of sex, right? And removing the federal recognition of transgender people. So to him, it is about making LGBTQ people and how they show up illegal. It is about creating a obscenity law in so many different ways where we can't show up and be ourselves, right? And so now every other agency at the federal level has to follow suit. And then you see that trickle down to the state level, right? Now, I do want to be clear. A lot of the things that we're seeing at the federal level, we have seen pop up in states like Florida and Texas. Shit, I can cuss.
Well, what's done is done. Keep going.
Okay. What we're seeing is in in places like Florida and Texas, they are siblings, right? And they're doing similar things and they're causing, elements of harm. Now we're seeing it pop up in North Carolina. If we look at this year, it makes no sense that we're seeing so many of these executive orders that the president signed are being duplicated at the state level, right? Where there are ballot measures popping up, or there's legislative bills that have been introduced that clearly make it illegal to even say the word trans, to even identify as trans, or just to be queer or LGBTQ as a whole. And so these are some of the things across executive actions that have rippling effects. The third thing that I want to name is SCOTUS. We all know that we can't trust the Supreme Court, right? Two of the most critical cases over the last year, the most recent one is Chili's v. Salazar, which the court weakened the state's ban on conversion therapy by framing them as speech issues, right? When we think about the United States v. Scrimetti, the court allowed bans on gender affirming care for minors, right? And there is a very clear lapse in understanding of what gender affirming care is and what conversion therapy is and the way it harms so many different people, right? So when you're saying on one hand, people cannot seek out the care that they need and that their bodily autonomy doesn't matter, but I would rather ensure that you can go through conversion therapy and truly hurt and harm yourself in some different ways. Things are not connecting, right? And I think we all as a group see that there is a lapse, that there is something that is happening within these agencies, because we have a lot of people leading these agencies who are clearly not qualified, and they're not listening to the staff members that have been there and that have been like yelling and saying, no, this is not right and this is not what you should do. The other thing that I want to name is that voting rights and the way people are required to show up in their civic duty is not only overwhelming people, but people do not feel like there's going to be an election in November for midterms. Right. And so this is where one of my questions to one of the faith leaders from my hometown is, how are you getting back to old school elements of organizing? When we think about the civil rights era, churches, synagogues, places of worship, places of faith were used as symbols and, safety, places of safety for people to come in and strategize and figure out how can we get to the next level, right? How are we replicating that today? And how are we showing up for our people in ways that serve them? That, again, goes beyond the pulpit, right? And so it is very, very interesting when you bring up voting rights, especially in Black and Brown communities. We are starting to see that there is low synergy in certain spaces and places, mostly with voters between the age of 18 and 30, right? But older generations understand it. But so now we're having to figure out what are the push-pull factors that are pulling people into this, corner, right? Pushing them into this corner. And now they're feeling as though, well, what is the point of voting? Right. And something that I'm so, glad to, say is like when we look at what has happened, not just in the last midterms, but also in this last primary cycle, more people showed up and showed out. And now we're seeing that things are definitely starting to shift. And if things were not starting to shift, that is going to be bad for those who are not pro LGBTQ, they would not be coming after us the way they are. They are afraid. They are scared that people are waking up. People are seeing the truth through the lies, and they do not want to ensure that people can actually vote come November. And so one of my call to actions for everyone here is for you to have a conversation with your faith leader. Figure out how they're going to show up in the upcoming months to educate people, right? Now, some faith leaders may not necessarily feel comfortable telling folks who to vote for, right? And, Reverend, please, jump in and, tell me how folks can show up in that way to just ask those questions and to ensure that people know, like, hey, I need to have a conversation with you about things that are impacting me because affordability is getting higher. Gas is $50 a gallon and it's slated to go up more. We're in a war that we don't want to be in, right? And so things are compounding and causing more people to consider what their options are, and we need members that are going to be empowered, that are going to choose us over party. And so that is my call to action to you all. I think I've been over 10 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
Thank you for that, Alan. I really do appreciate you providing so much of the perspective that we need around being able to engage this discourse and say, when we talk about LGBTQ rights, it's actually not just LGBTQ rights. Um, while we may have a niche of rights and accommodations that we may be looking for, everything in the vicinity of how we understand human rights is LGBTQ rights. And that our communities have a responsibility to be able to engage, to learn, and to collaborate to protect those rights. Going against war and the killing of innocent lives, seeing that affordability is getting out of control, and being able to look at our neighbors and saying that they shouldn't be harmed by institutions like ICE and CBP, like all of that is LGBTQ stuff. And a question that I am going to ask in a little bit is going to be about trying to dig a little deeper around the misconceptions or sort of the things that are unpalatable when we try to do this work, across lines of difference. But I want to be able to actually speak a bit more intentionally about sort of the national discourse and how we look at it from the lens of faith, especially as Christian nationalism has come up. Christian nationalism, for those that don't know, just to give it a bit of a primer, is a system where people believe that the base value and structure of a nation identifies deeply with Christianity in the case of the United States. So that American values are Christian values, or sometimes it's said as Judeo-Christian values, and vice versa. And it's important to be able to recognize that it's not just saying that every Christian is a Christian nationalist. It is saying that there is a particular usage of understanding the lens of Christianity and the role that it's played in the formation of the United States of America to then justify a lot more of the agenda that's trying to be achieved, particularly under this administration. And it's important to recognize that because that doesn't mean everyone has to be Christian to go with the values of Christian nationalism. And I want to mention a Supreme Court case as an example, which was Mahmoud versus Taylor, which was another case that was brought by the court last year, that decided that people could opt out from taking, lessons for their kids in school, K through 5 in particular, if I remember correctly, that may relate to themes of gender and sexual diversity. And the predicament that held because the main plaintiff in the case was a Muslim person who was backed by an organization called Alliance Defending Freedom. When you find the right people to be on the same page with your agenda, it is very easy to be able to see how religion can be maligned and weaponized against marginalized communities to make them feel more vulnerable, to make them feel less safe. But while we hear those kinds of cases taking place, it is also really important to see that there are counter narratives and counter coalitions that are developing to push back. One of the examples in the Mahmoud versus Taylor case was that there was an amicus brief that was signed by multiple faith communities and organizations representing various traditions who said that that is not an offense to our First Amendment rights. It is actually a control of free speech and expression of people who identify as LGBTQ. And you don't get to hear that because the discourse runs in such a way that if it's meeting a need, if it's meeting an agenda, you may not hear about it. So, one of the ways that we're making sure that people do know more about these shifts in attitude towards LGBTQ people is through this report that I'm putting in the chat from the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI. They just released a new version of their American Values Atlas, which talks about a lot of the attitudes that are shifting around LGBTQ issues. And you'll be really fascinated to know that from those people who were polled, and there were over 20 some thousand people who were polled, which is a significant survey, there are majority sentiments that favor protections for LGBTQ people across various issues. And this is a very fascinating thing to hear when it runs completely opposite to the discourse that you're hearing on the ground or what you might hear on media channels and social media. So it's very important to consider that there is research that is backing that there are faith communities that you can trust who want to be your allies in the work to protect queer and trans people. And it's a matter of being able to know that you can find those relationships locally because there may be more people that harbor positive sentiments if you know where you can find them. And it's good to have the numbers that back up the stories of why this work needs to be done. And it's so valuable for us to be able to enter this discourse in a way that doesn't just assume that someone is against you because they hold a different identity than you do. And this is a key part of why these kinds of conversations are necessary between communities of faith and LGBTQ plus people, where we know that we can look at each other as allies for solidarity and to be able to actually share concerns that are very clearly impacting us across the board. Higher gas prices, higher grocery prices, war happening. The list goes on for how we all get affected because of it. So it's important for us to be able to see that opportunity to connect and collaborate further. So with that, I am going to now bring us together to be in shared conversation so that our panelists can ask questions of each other. And we can then start sort of getting some ideas going, sharing more resources, and then opening it up to the folks that are on the call with us. So if anyone has thoughts or questions that they want to share with each other, please go right ahead.
So I'd like to jump in and kind of respond to something Alan said at the very end of his time. And that is about how people can approach particularly their home clergy or the clergy in their communities. And it may sound like a really rudimentary answer, but I would say it is really about talking to those folks, about sitting down with them and making sure that they understand what you yourself believe about a certain issue and about why that issue is important to you and why you believe that your congregation, your mosque, your synagogue, your whatever faith community you're part of should be working in that area. Again, it may sound very basic, but sometimes clergy just, particularly if you're in a larger congregation or worship space, clergy may simply not know that something is an issue for their members. They may look out at their. I speak as a white person who has often engaged in predominantly white spaces. So a white clergy person may look out at their very white, say, suburban congregation and think, well, housing affordability, yeah, is an issue, but this doesn't seem like something that's big for my congregation. And there may be stories there, either personal or very contemporary stories that are leading people or people are feeling called to work in that area. Um, this is where pastors or clergy just need to hear from their members. They need to hear from the people that they're interacting with on a daily or a weekly basis. Um, and I would say some clergy can easily respond in those moments. Some can take it under advisement, do more research. Some clergy, and I want to encourage everyone to remember, and this is when we can go down a rabbit hole very easily here about money and faith, or money in the church, or money in religion. But clergy, many clergy working in congregations still, this is the main source of their income. So unfortunately, some clergy have to look at an issue and say, I would love to talk more about racial justice. I would love to talk more about LGBTQ justice, but I'm afraid of what that might do to the people who essentially pay my salary. Um, it is a terrible dynamic, but I always tell folks to remember it because it can impact how your clergy person may respond to some of the more hot button issues. Um, that doesn't mean that's the right response. It also doesn't excuse that clergy person, but I put it out there because it is a consideration that clergy sometimes have to um, have to let inform some of their decisions. But again, I say if there's something you want your clergy to know about, go talk to them, sit down with them, get coffee, whatever it is for you and for that person. Let them know what you're passionate about, what you want to work in, what you want to see your congregation working on.
I really appreciate that point, and Alan, thank you for even bringing the call to action in this space. I've been reflecting a lot in the last couple of years around the action that clergy can take, and the amount of like power and sway that um, folks in those positions actually have, may not realize they have, may not acknowledge. Um, uh, that's definitely been a radicalizing point for me, right? Around the lack of of action, or the lack of boldness that often exists in just naming an injustice, right? Even just naming it and acknowledging it. I want to also name, for those of us who maybe don't have an active like relationship with a lot of clergy or with a faith community, how complicated this can be, right? And how difficult this can be. And this is where I guess I just want to elevate, especially allies. Like this is a place of action where I would love as a queer person to see allies take the lead in calling in clergy and guiding clergy on this is an important issue and this is action you can take, and how can we utilize the institution of this church community that we have um, to organize and to, Alan, as you were saying, right, like uh, uh, channel the ways in which church was central in the civil rights movement and in actually many other moments of organizing for justice. Um, so allies, this is your moment. Is kind of what I want to say. Especially because also, unfortunately, another just I think dynamic I'd like to name is that sometimes folks who uh, are maybe like visibly queer are not as listened to, right? And um, this is where it might be worthwhile to do a little bit of power mapping. I think about, in my experiences growing up, the role that like a lot of the aunties, the tias in the church played, right? There was a lot of sway that other individuals other than, say, the pastor of the church had in organizing and in taking action. Um, yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, bring those into the room. Um,
So, one of the questions that's actually coming to mind for me, and it's because I like to mix in a bit of the drama. Um, is, one of the hesitations that obviously might be coming up for folks that are on the call, but one that I've definitely heard from on the ground in different states, from different organizations and communities is, you know, there's always a hesitation in engagement between, LGBTQ individuals and organizations in trying to do work with faith-based communities or faith leaders. And I'm kind of curious, what you find to be some of the more challenging reasons as to why that happens. Especially at a time where distrust is, really sort of teetering in the behaviors of folks who might feel like, oh, if religion is causing so much of the chaos historically and now, why should we even bother seeing them as partners? Um, and I'm particularly aiming that question at you, Ben, of course, but um Zay, Alan, if there are any points where you feel like you might see it from the perspective of folks who are formerly Christian, you might be able to speak to that a little bit on more of the organizational slash advocacy work rather than just the personal one, where you might talk about where those hesitations come up.
Trying to figure out the best way of responding. Um, so acknowledging the immense amount of harm that organized religion, and unfortunately not just Christianity, has had on particularly LGBTQ people, but also other marginalized identities. Um, you know, obviously that hesitation is very real. I think one of the things, though, that one of the areas that faith communities bring and that can be very helpful, I think, to organizing efforts, LGBTQ, racial justice, any other area we might be talking about, is these are already set communities. These are places that people are already going to, albeit perhaps in smaller numbers than they used to, but these are places that people are going to. In some communities, churches still remain community hubs. In some cases, actually, we see congregations that may not be the hub of the neighborhood, but it's a hub of a certain community, and that community may be dispersed a bit, particularly in metropolitan areas, and hence have members who are from a range of areas or a range of identities. So again, these are places that people still come to, um, and present an opportunity for organizers to engage with people living in different areas, who come from potentially different identities, that you might not otherwise see brought together in um, in other communities. I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think that's one of the benefits that faith communities give to organizers, um, as long as we can engage with those spaces.
I just want to say that Demetrius, please, I apologize if I did not pronounce your name correctly. We will get to the space to be able to have you ask questions in just a few minutes. So if I could ask for your patience, I promise we'll make sure to come to you. Awesome.
I want to come in on this because so I was having a conversation with one of my great aunts the other day. And oh my God, I can't believe I'm saying this. But she voted for Trump twice. And she's a woman on a fixed income, and we were discussing Medicaid, Medicare, and her inability to get Obamacare because she like missed the enrollment period, and when you already have one of the other ones, you can't get both, right? And so while we were having the conversation, and I've been, preaching to my family for quite some time because I love starting riots within the family group chat. Um, I was like, hey, like, have you reached out to your pastor to figure out if they're going to, engage with either the, governor or whoever, because there's resources there where they can expand on certain, benefits for folks, right? And then we started to discuss the president and the administration. And something that came up that shocked the hell out of me is my aunt truly believes that President Trump is a Christian. She was like, no, he's a Christian and God is going to change his heart. And that made me immediately think about so many people who I notice and that I see that are blind to what real love looks like, right? To what, to the faith and the transparency of loving thy neighbor as your own and what that really looks like in practice. There is a lapse there, right? And that's something that is coming up for me with your question, Tahil, is so many people truly believe that the people that are in power are actual Christians that want the best for all people, because that's the words that are coming out of their mouth, but their actions are not proving that at all. And so I'm like, that's where we need more truth tellers that are faith leaders, that are, clergy members, right? That can push back and, name that, right? Similar to Bishop, what is the bishop's name that appealed to the president?
Bishop
Is it
Buddy.
Marion Buddy.
Yes, yes. So like people like that are fearless and that are going to actually name what needs to be done and how folks can show up. And then I feel like the more we have people doing that, then we'll start to see a change, and people having the trust to work with their faith leaders to do more.
Zay, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I think going down the same train of thought, I also had a recent conversation with a family member who is Christian and is in ministry, and had a um an acquaintance. I don't know that they're friends, but an acquaintance who's another minister who um uh, caused harm and was being held accountable for harm, significant harm. And I think, um, there's also, like, to add to this point that Alan is making, like a lot of people in ministry, frankly, that get away with harm. I mean, we all see this, right? We see this so commonly. And this particular individual we were talking about, there was a court case, right? Like, it was a crime essentially. Um, and they served time. And after serving time, the church took them back and reinstated this individual's pastorship. Is that the right terminology? I'm not sure, but I think yeah, that conversation, just what you're saying, Alan, made me think of like this conversation, right? And made me think of like the mindset of the folks in that particular church, right? That I don't have a relationship with that church, but they took the pastor back. And I find it very fascinating, the attachment a lot of folks have, right? To, I don't know if it's familiarity, if it's just like a sense of loyalty to folks they've known, right, for a long time. And that also is making me think of what Ben said earlier around a lot of these communities already being set, right? Um, so I don't know what the answer is as far as exactly like handling those types of obstacles that exist inherently with a lot of faith communities. To be frank, that's the reason, one of the reasons why I just decided to remove myself from the label of Christian, is because I felt like if I were going to keep that identifier, I was going to have to spend the whole rest of my life um doing apologetics, right? For like, oh, how can I be a Christian and a gay person and also believe these things and do these things? And I just didn't want that work. I just didn't want that work. I can embody the love, I can embody the spirituality, I can embody the teachings that I do treasure from my upbringing, um, without having to call it something specifically, without having to call it Christianity, which at this point, like for me in my own personal journey, I just felt like the that name and that identifier at this point like means something else. People hear it and it has so much baggage. I didn't want to deal with the baggage, right? And I wanted to be able to be a person in the world, be active in the world, build relationships in community, um, uh, uh, without that baggage and like fresh, so that people are really encountering what I'm, how I'm living, right? And what I'm living. Um, I had so many other thoughts popping off while Ben and Ellen were talking. Yeah, I think I'm also thinking a little bit about the culture piece to a lot of faith communities, and how faith usually is very deeply um like intermixed with a sense of cultural identity outside of the faith identity. Um and that becomes an anchor, it becomes a safe space. I know a lot of folks with an immigrant story, for example, and it's like the when coming to the United States and coming to a place like Ohio, not speaking much English, right? Like churches become a very safe and initial place to find some grounding. Finding a church with other members of the church that are also, right, like from where you are from. And I don't know, I think people use faith communities in different ways. I think people approach faith communities in different ways. And to do this work, it's just important to acknowledge all of those different realities that are taking place, right? With what faith communities are to people. Um, a last thing I kind of want to name is that I think for for Westerners, especially white folks that grow up in the United States and grow up in faith communities here, I think that there's a very individualistic culture that is intertwined with the way a lot of white Americans, especially, but not exclusively, approach faith, right? Like, even in my own upbringing, there was this sort of sense of your Christianity is about your personal relationship with God. And one of the things I wonder if what that does a little bit is it might um it might be a way that people get permission to disengage from community and like community action, right? Like I go to church or whatever. That's about me and my soul and my salvation and my personal faith. What relevance does some type of social justice action have at my church? I just sort of wonder if maybe this is a mindset that also might be like present, right, in the ether, that might be contributing, um, to the obstacles that we face in engaging some faith communities and faith leaders in social action. A last piece I'll just quickly say, and then we can go. That I was thinking about very freshly, and this is because of something someone said to me about their Christianity, and it's the idea of a fallen world, a sinful world, and the idea that really, as a Christian, this person was speaking for themselves. They said, my Christianity and my practice is about the next life. It's not even about this world, right? It's about salvation in the next life. And a light bulb sort of went off for me, and I realized, you know what? How many folks maybe have a mindset like that? And and might be using that as permission also to disengage because, oh, well, this world is already not the point. This life is already, um, uh, I don't know, it's a means to an end. It's to the afterlife. So there was just a bit of a light bulb moment for me where I was like, wait a minute, and I don't think that that's a mindset that only exists in Christian communities. I think it's a force that can exist and emerge in any kind of an environment. So I don't know. I find it worthwhile to try and like identify some of these like cultural forces, these belief forces that I do think themselves can be toxic and that we need to kind of name that and call them out and invite conversation about that for folks.
Yeah, and all of this really, you know, really elevates a few key things, right? We can't also talk as if like LGBTQ people, as we have examples here on the panel, are not religious or spiritual people in their own right. And not just because, oh, this is a fall away, this is a response to trauma. It's also because historically speaking, there's a lot of presence of trans communities and stories that are deeply associated with faith and spirituality, that actually supersede a lot of the conservative narratives that are just only the phenomenon of empire and of the last century of, really conservative politics taking over narratives. So let's not forget and, confuse that with any of these real conversations that have like real consequences. I remember making this reference to a friend of mine that sometimes when I go to West Hollywood, it actually feels kind of like I might be going to evangelical services. Uh, and I would say that not because it was just being tongue in cheek, but it was because there were elements of, spaces for LGBTQ people that often, when trying to develop a space for our own community, were actually becoming deeply misogynistic, deeply transphobic, deeply racist, and deeply exclusivist in the similar ways that I might imagine a really conservative faith space might want to treat other marginalized communities. So when I came to that epiphany, it kind of freaked me out because I think to a point you're making, Zay, is like culturally speaking, that's really trying to tackle our changing understanding of belonging and what that ultimately means for us and how ultimately belonging as an idea and when it's centered on solidarity rather than just relationships, it actually can really change the way we understand why we build community for one another and with one another. So that was just something that was really, coming up for me. And I think it's also just as important to consider, like, again, this is a discourse across traditions. I come from a Hindu and Sikh background. There is some deep, complex, history and conflict with understanding gender and sexual diversity, for how it exists in the Hindu context, for how it's associated with, I think, very deep and complex, ways of looking at mythology and theology. While with the Sikh community, it is more of a complex relationship with how we understand our responsibility to other people in full regard and full understanding of their authentic selves and entirely who they are. Um, but when you try to talk about those things with everyday people or even priests, they are like, oh no, like this is not an LGBTQ affirming space. We don't do same-sex marriage. We don't have any form of marriage equity outside of cisgender men and women. And it's because the discourse may be different for them, and they also carry patriarchal tendencies, cisgender heteronormative tendencies, some that are impacted by colonialism, and some that, brought out worse forms of patriarchy that may have already existed within specific theologies. So it's kind of important to, really map out and understand that, like, it's like good news and bad news that this is not only Christianity's problem, that this is a part of the many other traditions that share similar problems, but that this is also a discourse that we need to have that also centers interfaith literacy. That, Alan mentioned several times that, like, there's he wears a specific hat thinking about things in a Christian lens because that is the upbringing that he has. And that sometimes that doesn't translate well with other faith communities that you might be trying to get into the loop. So it's important to make sure that you are bridging the gap in certain ways of trying to level yourself with an understanding of saying, oh, yes, we have to involve more than Christians in the discourse, and we have to involve more than folks that fell off from Christianity in the discourse. Um, because it ends up being a really tough situation when other folks want to try to get involved. And it's like, oh, there's either only Christian clergy here or like anti-theistic, anti-Christian folks in the discourse. And we want to be able to make sure that we don't get caught in those predicaments where those are necessary conversations that actually are becoming then deterrents for the kind of collaboration people might be looking for. Um, so with that in mind, I'm going to put my facilitator's privilege to the side. There are folks that have questions. I got a question from the chat, but before I ask that one, Demetrius, I am hoping to let you unmute yourself so you can ask a question.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm sick, so I will not be coming off the camera, but I'm a licensed social worker and a local therapist. I used to work at Kaleidoscope Youth Center, so I had a lot of these conversations directly with young people, people ages 13 all the way up to 24. And I've been to a lot of different conferences. I've attended a lot of leadership programs. And one thing I've learned consistently over the past 6 years or so is there is a lot of religious trauma within the LGBTQ community. And it is hindering people's ability to kind of look past what's happened to them in their history. There are a lot of people who have grown up in cults and they didn't realize it was a cult until they were, in their young adulthood. So, and unfolding all of that, they're now thrown into, a lot of different things. And it's just a very difficult realization for them to accept, let alone unpack and have deeper conversations on how can I get through this and get back into the church. I also think there are a lot of dated opinions and outlooks from those aunties and great aunts and grandmothers in the churches, and great grandfathers too. I am somebody that grew up in the South, so I had a great grandfather who was a deacon in the church. So I sang, I was, a regular in church services, and I came out at 14, and that's when I started realizing my pastor was personally picking out sermons to identify promiscuous youth or youth that go against their parents' well wishes. And that wasn't an isolated experience. So, trying to exist in those environments, even when you have relatives and people who are guidance and a community for you, it's still debilitating and marginalized, along with what everybody else is saying, the hegemonic patriarchy and the trauma, both primary and secondary, faced by people that are going and attending church services.
Thank you for naming all of that. I think that is, really a deeper reflection of why building these relationships between communities is not as easy as just introducing them, right? It's very clear that when there is intentionality from people in power, whether that power is a pastor in a church or a head of state, using language, using sermons, using quotes, using whatever they can to be able to justify a theology or justify a perspective, they will do what they can to be able to engage in that kind of spiritual abuse. And we've seen that phenomenon, especially at the community level. We have, heard many of those kinds of stories where that kind of violence has been allowed, and it's been perpetuated, unfortunately. Um, with a lot of folks not wanting to respond again because of this idea of, Zay, the story you mentioned of like there is a tendency to veer towards comfort, norms, traditions, or nostalgia in what we try to see as community, that if anything tries to like touch it, like someone taking away a puzzle piece, you don't want to destroy the whole puzzle piece by the theory of those people. You want to put that puzzle piece back. And unfortunately, sometimes it's not just putting the puzzle piece back because the puzzle was wrong in the first place in trying to create community. And it's so important to be able to acknowledge that like this work is very, very entrenched. It takes a long time to make it happen, but it becomes so sustainable when it hits that right point of connection. And one of the really good examples of that actually is Minneapolis. A lot of the faith-based organizing that was happening with folks there were particularly through Project Isaiah and March, which were faith-based organizations led by LGBTQ clergy. And that's a significant thing to be able to emphasize because one of my predecessors, Reverend Rebecca Vocal, was one of the folks on the front lines who continues to be on the front lines with fellow clergy to be able to actually meet the moment with the right discourse, theology, and actions that actually gave a different perspective on how faith is showing up during times of injustice. Which is why it's actually led to a major wave of in like new interpretations of seeing why engaging with faith communities is a valuable part of LGBTQ organizing work. So thank you for that once again, Zamitrius, for sharing your perspective and giving us some of the perspectives as to why like the work is important, but there are important things to consider as to why engaging it is not as easy as a starting conversation. Um, a question that I got in the chat that I want to be able to ask um, is mainly about the ways faith leaders can empower their community to vote while also following denominational guidelines around not projecting elected officials from the pulpit. So, not allowing there to be a way to show a partisan support for something, but inviting people to be able to engage more intentionally in the electoral process. I have something for that, but I want to make sure the panelists answer.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry, y'all. I want to lean into whatever Ben would say as the reverend on this call, but I think for me something that I constantly think about is the same way we apply pressure to members of Congress, we have to apply that same pressure to um clergy members and faith leaders, right? I know that right now a lot of folks are concerned about what that could do to the church and their 501c3 status. I get that, right? And there are ways that clergy members can show up that meets the moment where you're not necessarily telling people who to vote for. You're focusing on the issues and you're focusing on which individual is naming that they're going to focus on the issues that are impacting your flock, right? And that I think that is a constant question, and no shade. I also think that is often a cop out for clergy members to not want to do things out of fear right? When in reality, they have a lot more leeway to do and say so much more, especially when I've seen it in practice on the Hill, where just a clergy member coming in telling a story flipped several votes, right? And they didn't even have to tell them, do not vote for this. But it was simply because they came in, told the story, and gave the impact of what that done or what that proposed legislation, regulation, whatever it is, would or will do to their, member, that changed everything. So there's definitely ways that, they can engage. And I'm open to being a resource to, clergy members who would like that insight. And I'll make sure that my email is in the chat.
Joseph, you started to say something before.
I was simply going to offer that even just information about how to vote or how to register to vote itself is helpful. Like the amount of people I encounter on a regular basis um, that just have false information, that alone could be a way, right, for clergy members to arm themselves with knowledge and actually spread that knowledge alone. That's all. That's all I had. Well, I want to hear what you were going to say.
So honestly, that was the first point I was going to make, is that clergy can and or congregations or whoever can and should put out to their members, here's where you find your polling place. Here's where you um, go to register to vote. Here's, that information can be put up by churches. Um, so there's this interesting, and I'm trying not to nerd out, but there is this interesting thing from last summer where the IRS said that they would no longer enforce what's called the Johnson Amendment. It's what makes it essentially out of bounds for 501(c)(3)s, including congregations, to lobby, to recommend candidates, etc. Problem is that law is still in the books, and the IRS could come back at any time and reinforce it. So we still, the guiding wisdom is still for clergy not to endorse people from the pulpit or in bulletins or on websites or whatever else. But another thing that clergy and congregations can do is wherever you have, most congregations across religions have some sort of weekly bulletin or newsletter or whatever. It is perfectly fine to put there, hey, here are some, bills, here are some things that are happening that you might want to know more about, congregation, and here's where you can go and do your own research. Or here's something that a conservative group put out, and here's something that a progressive group put out. Clergy can do that as well. Again, we get into some murky waters when clergy start endorsing people from the pulpit. Even if you have a small congregation, I have a very small congregation, they're all progressive, most of them are queer. I know how they fall politically. It's still ethically incorrect for me to endorse someone or to endorse a candidate from the pulpit.
And Ben, thank you for actually, naming that, because it's going to be really important to name a couple of things to support that. First is last week, a court did actually uphold the Johnson Amendment after the attempt from the Trump administration last year to try to ease some of the restrictions on that. So the fact that that's been reinforced by a court right now means still in the books, still can be something people can act on. And it's important for you all to have access to resources that can help you navigate through some of that. And I'm able to plug that in as the facilitator for the task force, because we actually worked on two guides to be able to help address some of this. The first is our guide for advocacy activities in faith communities, where we sit and break down some of the understandings of the Johnson Amendment, what you can and cannot do, what does actually lobbying look like in a way that allows you to be able to do it? Because guess what? Faith communities can actually lobby for specific pieces of legislation, but they have to be very careful about what that looks like. And I worked with the Alliance for Justice's Bolder Advocacy initiative to be able to sit with a lawyer and actually figure out what some of that language looks like, and how you can all think about that work that you may want to do, or that it may help demystify some of the misconceptions that you might have. The second guide that I'm sharing with you all is our guide on faith and legislation, where, oftentimes, because it's very hard to be able to, speak from the pulpit about specific resources or specific candidates, that it doesn't mean that there is no opportunity for moral discourse around the issues that you care about. So we created a set of guiding questions and recommendations to help you think about how you might be able to engage in some of the work that your communities care about. And this can be a space where you're thinking about it both in a faith context and an LGBTQ context. So people are more than welcome to take these guides, to use them however it's useful for them. We're really happy to share that in the next couple of weeks, we will have a Spanish version of these guides available to be able to share. And we're also hoping to get guides available in Korean and Portuguese. So if there are any other folks that you know that maybe could benefit from having these resources available for translation, please send them my way, because we want to make sure that this is as accessible as possible. And seeing that we're already a couple minutes past 7:30 Eastern, I want to be cognizant of that time. For those people who may have questions and stuff, I will be happy to take those questions for you all by putting my email in the chat. Um, and I just want to be able to say thank you so much to Ben, to Zay, to Alan, who had to step away, and to, Love Boldly, Equality Ohio, and the task force for helping, bring us into this conversation together. We know that we probably didn't address many things, but this is just an opportunity to make sure that the conversation can keep going. For those who are based in Ohio, please reach out to Ben and to Zay to be able to see how you can get the support that you're looking for. Because we need advocacy, we need our faith partners involved, and we need collaboration, and it's all going to start where you're at. So please make sure to reach out to them accordingly. And yes, just thank you all for your time. Thank you to the Interfaith Center at Miami University, who has been hosting or co-hosting with the task force this series on LGBTQ programming. And yeah, I don't know if there are any last words from Ben or Zay before we go.
I just wanted to say, oh, Demetrius jumped. I was going to say thanks for the commentary on spiritual trauma, because I think we could have a whole discussion just on that. But thanks to Hio for facilitating this, and thanks Ben for being here as well and joining me and everybody else.
Thank you both.
Alrighty, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please be on the lookout for more programming from the task force, from our fellow organizations who co-sponsored today, and we'll see you very soon. Take care.